And we are live.
We are live, boys. Hello, hello. My name is Ty Tuck, and this is my fellow co-host over here,
Griffin Norris.
And today we will be covering guerrilla warfare today, I believe, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So this is a very relevant topic to U.S. history, actually, because if you notice the past 3 or so wars we've been in, all guerrilla warfare. Vietnam, kind of infamous, one of the first losses, if you will, of the U.S. military. And then Afghanistan, Iraq was a very prolonged...
We lost.
Very, very prolonged guerrilla warfare. And then if you want to argue about it technically, we have been doing guerrilla warfare since the very, very beginning of our nation.
Yep, exactly. So the origins of guerrilla warfare basically started from Native Americans fighting the Spanish, the Appalachians, I believe they were called.
The Apaches.
No, they were like the, here, I got it. Jamie, can you pull that up? Great.
This is what happened to that 2 people, guys, okay? You give it a moment.
I don't know, but they were like the Appalachee. Or Apalachi?
Please don't cancel us.
It's the Apalachi.
Please don't cancel us.
Are you seeing that? The Apalachi?
The Iroquois?
No, the Apalachi.
The Appalachee.
I said that, right?
You said no.
I said Appalachie at first. Okay.
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 I didn't say you were wrong.
Anyways, the first kind of recorded, instances was in fact the Appalachee fighting against the Spanish. So clearly, Native Americans have, had the most efficient fighting style. Maybe not the most honorable, but certainly a very efficient one. And they used that against the Europeans throughout North America.
And this is where the Americans learned it from.
Exactly, from the Native Americans.
Right. And
then Americans learned it from the Native Americans because at the time we were all colonists.
And then I would want to mention is that many colonists, especially in the kind of northern regions, did lots of hunting. Okay, so you had a lot of experienced woodsmen who had these rifles. Yes, they're called rifles. And they would be hunting around, right? And they'd be trading with Native Americans, or sometimes they'd even be fighting with Native Americans. And so that's where they're learning all these strategies from. And if you really want to think about it, guerrilla warfare is really kind of inherent in a lot of Native American cultures. Like, kind of infamous example is one of the trials to becoming a chief for like the Apache tribe was you had to steal a horse and be unnoticed, right? So guerrilla warfare was really kind of, obviously it didn't start with Native Americans, but it was really, Native Americans refined it because it was their culture. It was their way of life, basically. The way of, I wouldn't say way of life, way of warfare, okay?
And they definitely had different social structures than European nations just because they were, more focused on like the tribal aspect, which I think led to less defined boundaries of honor and like righteousness that, kind of the chivalry, so to speak, that the Europeans felt and kind of prompted them to use the tactics of which they're so infamously known, which is basically line up in a field and shoot until the other side runs away.
Right. And then it also mentions that Native Americans rarely raised this sort of armies that Europe has constantly seen throughout its history because American population was lower in general. And combat was generally, especially in North America, combat was just done through raiding parties. Now, the difference would be in South America with the Aztecs, you would see lots of mass armies. You would see mass Aztec armies, and it would just kind of clear itself by everybody else. Of course, Cortez came around, disease, and the population went down.
And I think you raised a really good point there, which is essentially that, when you say Native American armies were not... they didn't have like standing armies. That's exactly the position that the United States was put in during the first revolution, right? So when they're both in those positions, I think it might be, especially if you have a population of, like you said, experienced woodsmen, it's definitely a kind of a chance, or you're forced to do it because of the situation that you're placed into. And I think that's kind of what the Native Americans and the Americans at the time, I guess the colonists at the time, were really experiencing, was kind of it was by necessity that they were forced to use guerrilla warfare.
Right. And then if you want to move on, we're going to talk about kind of the first really instance of guerrilla warfare in the Revolutionary War, which was in Lexington and Concord, the very beginning, where infamously, Paul Revere made his little gallop around, right? Few lanterns if by sea, one lantern if by land, and essentially when the British came around and they failed to seize arms, and of course the shot heard around the world happened. And then what happened was the British soldiers, they would retreat back to Boston. And on the way, American militiamen all over the place. They come from the trees, they come from like behind fences. They would just harass them because the British were going down the road, naturally, right? As a conventional army usually would. And then American militiamen from all sides would go around and just go fire and fire, fire, fire. And then they basically experienced this the whole way back to Boston, where they just kind of hold up for a bit.
Yeah. And then, they had multiple other instances of that, especially during that Revolutionary War period. Because I don't think the British were as used to fighting these tactics. The Native Americans obviously used them, but the combination of both American guns and Native American tactics was especially deadly because, again, Washington was kind of fighting a retreat, if you know what I mean, like a fighting retreat. And that was, that the tactic kind of lends itself to that. Leave 3 guys behind and shoot at them until, they just quietly slip away through the trees. And then, your enemy just wasted 3 hours through, and then maybe 10 men because you just sent 3 behind to delay them.
Right. And I did want to mention is Europe did have these rifle divisions of skirmishers, right? They would be irregulars, what they would call them. And they would generally perform scouting action in the rear guard, but they wouldn't really do guerrilla warfare in the kind of way that was seen in the Revolutionary War. That's because battles were often fought in open fields, and then after initial skirmishes were over, the riflemen would usually just fold into the line, essentially. And I think it's important to note that Britain did have some experience in the French and Indian War against guerrilla warfare. But of course, a lot of this experience didn't really carry through because the leading officer during them was George Washington. And I think this is a key point to mention, is that while not completely unfamiliar, it was still a fairly new experience for a lot of the, let's say, what's what I'm looking for, a lot of the commission-based British Army at the time, which essentially meant that officers bought their positions.
Yeah, and I think another thing that's often overstated is the significance of the guerrilla warfare, because a lot of the time people kind of make it seem like all of the decisive battles were fought through guerrilla warfare. And while there was raiding parties on British, supplies and things like that, the majority of the decisive battles of the war were fought in a conventional format.
Right. And then one of the first things George Washington actually did after, I say, around the first year of the Revolutionary War, was just form that Continental Army. The infamous Valley Forge. You had Baron von, I believe, Steuben?
Yes, Steuben, yep.
Yeah, Baron von Steuben. He was a Prussian military officer who came from Prussia and just taught the Americans what to do. They wrote the American Army's first field manual. And a lot of those influences can still be seen today. But essentially, that professional army is kind of a big key point in the Revolutionary War, where that's when George Washington really started winning, if you will.
Definitely, yeah. And, I feel like I think the American Army it's pretty interesting because while, guerrilla warfare wasn't a super large factor in the War of 1812, I think it was, more of a thing during, what would you say? World War
I wouldn't say guerrilla warfare really showed up again until
World War II, honestly.
Vietnam, I'd say even.
I think so. You had the British, so-called Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, and I think Americans were basically inducted into that, American servicemen, and they did lots of things during World War II that were definitely considered guerrilla warfare. Like there was an American on the attack that blew up the Norsk hydro plant, which was a heavy water facility in the north of Norway. They basically went in, they dropped them in off the side of the off into one of the fjords, and they backpacked and biked their way all the way to the hydro plant, and then blew up the hydro plant with some like mines that you can attach. And then and then there's multiple other examples, like during the D-Day, like when Americans landed on D-Day, there was another group that essentially took logs and trees and would like cut them down over the road. So then the whole armored convoy would have to stop. So they'd bring up a recovery vehicle from the back, right? And as the recovery vehicle's pulling out the trees off the middle of the road, it ran over a landmine, right? Anti-tank landmine. So then with just one anti-tank landmine, a couple of guys and some axes, you held up an armored convoy for 30 minutes while, the second recovery vehicle had to come out and pull the blown up recovery vehicle. And then, the next thing, maybe you chop 2 trees down, right, over the road, and they have to they have to minesweep the whole area, which takes another 30 minutes. So you're able to extremely delay an armored convoy by just maybe 3 or 4 lines. You can delay the mines for maybe 6 hours, right? Just by cutting down trees. And they have to, it's just an extremely asymmetrical but effective warfare tactic.
Right. And I think this would be a discussion for a later time. But if you really want to think about it, the very core of special forces paratrooper tactics was guerrilla warfare. You were basically just dropping a bunch of men far behind enemy lines and told them, hey, go do something. Like Rangers in D-Day, they would be attacking artillery positions, right? Or paratroopers, they'd be attacking special like bridges, houses, just like kind of guerrilla warfare. Or again, contrast World War II, you had the Free France movement. You had very infamous, or you had the Thai Liberation Front in Siam, right? There's lots of stuff like that where we had guerrillas fighting against professional armies and largely, I wouldn't say winning, but they largely achieved what they were looking for.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that guerrilla essentially just means a member of an asymmetrical force. So, for example, I believe it was coined in China during the Japanese occupation.
In practice, this just means any men that were not part of like a uniform division, right? They weren't like uniformed up and they weren't like classified as a soldier, I'd say, per se.
Yeah.
Exactly. But like he said, that distinction didn't really arise until what?
I think it could be wrong, but I think the Japanese occupation of China. But I could be wrong.
That would be around.
That would be 44, 43.
Yeah, it would be somewhere pretty late in the war.
Yeah. So yeah, and then you have obviously Vietnam, most infamous asymmetric. I mean, America dropped more bombs on Laos and Vietnam than both sides dropped in the entire World War I and World War II, which, think about it, it's a lot of bombs.
Right. This was a very crucial time for the U.S. Army, where they were going through a really awkward transitional phase, where they were just during the time of Cold War. They were very hyper geared up for what the Army refers to as combat against near peer countries, right? So the Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc, right? The U.S. Army is just simply not prepared to fight a guerrilla war.
And to be fair, I mean, the Soviets, they both sides pretty much. I mean, the Soviets got their butts handed to them in Afghanistan,
as we would later.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, just as we would. Which I think is just an example of how no one really was prepared to fight terrorists or guerrillas or really any asymmetric warfare, because again, both sides were so prepared to, fight the other side.
Right. And I think Vietnam is a really good example of how guerrilla warfare can be brutal at times for a conventional army, but I like to think that overall conventional warfare is better than guerrilla. And I think this is because it's really hard to achieve strategic objectives with guerrilla warfare alone. If you're attempting guerrilla warfare, it's hard to capture something. It's hard to hold something, as an army would usually do. That's kind of the main reason for war. It's like you want this land. You want to occupy this land. Guerrilla warfare is not how you would go about doing it.
Guerrilla warfare is, however, good for both like denial of an area, and then also weakening of the enemy's moral resolve. So, for example, the United States really didn't like Vietnam, and Vietnam, I think, at least the top brass kind of knew that if they could just stick it out, then the military would be forced to pull out at some point. So if you can kind of know what's going on in your enemy's mind, you can certainly know that you just have to survive for only a few more years or something, right?
Right. As the meme goes, objective, survive, right?
Yeah.
And then I wanted to point out is that guerrilla warfare is a really good way to fight back and resist against a more democratic nation, per se. Or simply put, the people will get sick of it. Like if you saw in Afghanistan, we were just tired of having people at war. We're tired of having hundreds of soldiers die every year. And sending care packages and all that kind of stuff.
I think another hallmark of the asymmetrical warfare is usually it's called asymmetrical warfare for a reason, right? So like the United States is using helicopters, right? And the Vietnamese were just jumping around in their rice paddies, right? So there's certainly an element of asymmetry to it, and kind of similar to the Native Americans, right? The Native Americans were both denying foreign invaders, and same thing with the Vietnamese. They were both relatively poor and kind of the common people fighting against a much more technologically advanced force. And ultimately, I think both, first of all, the Vietnamese were much more successful due to the fact that they had a much worse main weapon. And then also they were kind of constantly, like you said, unprepared for asymmetrical warfare.
Right. And to really tie this back into the U.S. is that recently we've been trying to intervene in countries that either didn't want to be intervened in, or just had lots and lots of local fighters willing to fight, right? And that's kind of the main thing to see is that the U.S. Army is just unprepared. It's not what the Army is meant to do. It's not what's geared up to do. And I think the reason why we see us, however, protracted guerrilla war is because we don't have anyone else to fight, right? We have terrorists, right? And then we just kind of...
We've turned into the world's police, right?
Right. And search and destroy missions don't really work out all the time.
Yeah.
Like Afghanistan was 10 years?
Exactly. And I think the major problem with both Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, right? All of these were examples of where America was seen as the bad guy, and maybe a guy that shot at your U.S. convoy is a baker by day, right? So you go into the town and everyone there hates you because you're the, opposing force.
Right.
And as, nobody's going to tell you like, oh, Jim the baker shot at you guys last night. So, I mean, once you have like overall public support, or the occupying force is definitely seen as the enemy, I don't think it's helpful or conducive to rooting out those said terrorists.
Right. That's the biggest problem with guerrilla warfare, is that you need the support of the civilian populace. If you do not have the civilian support, they're going to rat you out. Because you need to get supplies from somewhere. You need to hide the army somewhere. They need to rest. They need to eat, right? All these things rely on civilians. And unfortunately, conventional warfare generally means, especially against guerrilla warfare, it means scorched earth. They will destroy government infrastructure. They will kill civilians if they don't get what they want. Unfortunately, even the U.S. Army did that in Afghanistan. You see a lot of alleged war crimes happen with military police when interviewing prisoners.
Definitely.
And then, sorry, let me just go on real quick. If you want to see the effectiveness of an army against a conventional opponent, Iraq. We destroyed the entire Iraqi army in a few days. But then the second we launched ourselves in the guerrilla war, 10 years, and we got nothing out of it.
Yeah. just a collapsed republic.
Right. So I think we want to overall summarize this video, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So to kind of summarize, is just that guerrilla warfare has really been a thing that America has, well, traditionally starting in it, right? They learned from it, and all the way back to Revolutionary War, all the way back to Native Americans. But now, in recent times, we see us getting very involved, and we see us getting very, I don't know, very bad at it.
Yeah, it's ironic. We used guerrilla warfare to defeat the English from their colonizers, and the Vietnamese used guerrilla warfare to defeat the basically allies to their colonizers, the French.
Right, and we just kind of, I just want to highlight this for this episode, is that there is a trend of us losing in guerrilla warfare, and it's something to consider while maybe thinking about interventions in, say, Ukraine. I know a lot of people are getting bloodthirsty online, so to speak, and I just want to kind of highlight these concerns we have about in any kind of determined populace.
Yep, and then also, of course, the Vietnamese did not have a nuclear arsenal pointed at our face, so there's something to be said for that too.
Right, and then it's just that, just be careful about what we're thinking about. When discussing foreign policy, let's just think about this for a minute and consider really if war is the right answer sometimes.
Of course.
Right, anything else?
I think that's it.
All right, that will be it for today. This is episode 1 regarding guerrilla warfare.
Yeah.
And I'm Ty Patel.
I'm Griffin Norris, and this has been Whiskey Foxtrot Tango.
All right, see ya.